Now, the state of the ADRC does encompass more than the ADRC grant. So by that, I mean all of our grants, program, project grants, UO1s, everything. I also mean the Memory and Aging Project, the Memory Diagnostic Center, and the Memory and Aging Project Satellite. So if I want everyone to feel included because that's what this is meant to do. The actual presentation today, of course, is my selection of information to provide you. It's necessarily then, it's arbitrary. It won't include everything of importance. I don't want anyone to feel neglected if I don't specify your particular area of interest or your work or you by name. You all are part of the ADRC, and you all can take, hopefully, an appropriate sense of pride and sense of accomplishment for what we have achieved. And I hope to convey that with you. But nonetheless, I may have omitted important information or may have made mistakes. I should tell you those are entirely my own, and I take the blame for that in advance, but it's not, if I have made those mistakes or omissions, it's not meant to slight anybody. Please understand that. Let's just go through the handout for a moment. So the first part of it are just copies of the slides, but about, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through, there's something called Figure 1, and it refers to our funded grants. I will be talking about this and referring to this at an appropriate time in the presentation. On the back of Figure 1 is another grant structure that I'll be talking about, the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer Network. I am going to be talking about some specific awards. That's the next page. This page includes all the awards that we have a record of. We may have missed some, but this is what we have record of. So on the slide will only be a subset of these awards, but I wanted you to see how impressively individuals affiliated with the ADRC are acknowledged for their contributions. The next item in the handout is a glossary of terms, terminology. So when we're reporting information, writing grants, doing press releases, these are the terms that we use. So for example, if you look in there, it says DAT, dementia of the Alzheimer type, no apostrophe, no S, right? So we all remain consistent. This is our consistent use of our terminology. And then the last section in the handout, on the back of that page, it talks about the CDR and gives the relevant references for how we designate normality, non-demented status versus very mild or uncertain dementia versus dementia. So you can look at that, and again, this may be useful for you as you write research reports or research applications. And in the same way, we've listed the key ADRC references. If you need to reference how we sample our participants and how we assess them, that's all on here, including a lengthy discussion of our attempt to characterize people in the very mild stage of dementia. So this is for you, and hopefully it can serve you as a reference for terminology, key references, CDR 0.5 and the like. Well, this is what I'd like to accomplish today. I'd like to go through the history of the ADRC. I think it's always good to remember how things began and who did what. I'd like to talk about our current situation, what we're doing now and how we're doing it, how we're organized to do it, and how we're funded to do it. Spend a little bit of time on all the accomplishments that you all have achieved. Something, at least from my take, on the impact of this ADRC on the field at large. Then I want to spend the last part, it's not the most pleasant part, I put down the future, opportunities and threats. Unfortunately, I'm going to spend a lot of time on the threats because I think they really are genuine and we need to pay attention to them. So let's begin with the history. And the history begins with these individuals. Leonard Berg, Dick Torak, Charles Hughes, and then a little bit later, Jack Botwinick and Martha Sturant. So Leonard, I'm supposed to announce that being passed around is a sign-up sheet. This is a guest sign-in or something of that sort. We appreciate everyone signing in because then when we take the group photo, we can hopefully identify everybody so that we know who's who. Leonard Berg, Dick Torak, Charles Hughes, and others at Washington University in the 1970s began a discussion group about dementia. And from that discussion group, they decided to put in some grant applications. The grant applications only became successful when Jack Botwinick and Martha Sturant became involved. I put down enablers, and I'll tell you why I think these people are very important and deserve our gratitude. So here's the timeline. I've mentioned the discussion group called the Dementia Study Group. Leonard established that to talk about issues such as hydrocephalus, which was a hot topic in the department in 1972, normal pressure hydrocephalus. And then Dick Torak began writing a book on dementia, and he asked Leonard to contribute a clinical chapter, and so Leonard wanted to discuss the relevant literature, and they met around lunch on, guess what, Tuesday at 12 noon. So our ADRC seminar, noon seminar, is a direct descendant of this dementia, the brown bag study group. So what they found is that there wasn't much in the literature on dementia, and they decided to do a natural history study, started themselves. Remember, at this time, Leonard was in full-time private practice, and they put in an application, and it did not do well. An R01 application was not funded. In the critique, the reviewers said, it's great that you're trying to set up a grant, but you don't have a lot of expertise. There is expertise right at your institution in the Department of Psychology. So go talk to Jack Botwinick and Martha Sturant. And they did. And that was very fruitful, as you'll see, for the application, but also from the Botwinick and then later the Sturant laboratory came many key individuals for the ADRC. So Martha and Jack trained people like Warren Danziger, who was the first sort of executive administrator, Emily Labarge, our initial psychometrician, Betsy Grant, Dorothy Edwards, and Eileen Whittles, who was another administrator. So it was really a very seminal connection, and Martha and Leonard in particular had a very, very productive and collegial career together. So with the addition of Jack and Martha to the grant, they did get funding in 1979, but notice it was paltry. It was $31,000 to establish the feasibility. I hadn't truly appreciated this, but I think, and you'll see another example in just a moment, this sort of sensitized Leonard to the grantsmanship process. He was not a person who liked being unsuccessful, and not getting grants bothered him, and you'll see how that worked out in a little bit. So after this one-year feasibility study, then in 1979, Leonard was awarded an R01 called Healthy Aging and Senile Dementia. And it was a 3-year study. Notice the aim to test the value of tests regarding the clinical course of dementia of the Alzheimer type versus normal aging. We're still, of course, doing that. Are structural changes the result of aging or unrecognized disease? Now we call it preclinical Alzheimer's disease. And the instruments that we still use in one form or another, the ISP, the clinical assessment, and then the rating scale, clinical dementia rating scale, were introduced at that time. So this was a very important R01 for us. It established the first cohort of 117 individuals, including 58 who were CDR 0. And you notice the 0.5 category, you can see where people who talk about MCI use CDR 0.5, because it's really a description of what people now talk about as MCI. So very forward-looking natural history study. And at the end of 3 years, the investigators thought that they would translate this into a program project. So they put in an application in 1982 that was not funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, which had funded the R01. So this again sensitized Leonard. He doesn't like rejection, I can tell you that. And so ever since, those of you who go back to those days of site visits and so forth, there was a palpable sense of tension so that we would be successful in getting the grant. So we always were under a little bit of duress imposed by Leonard. I don't know how many rehearsals we would have for each one of these site visits, but it was quite arduous. But here's where Emily Labarge and Bill Landau came in, because in 1982, the R01 was over. They already had the cohort. They were studying people on an annual basis, but they had no funding. So Bill Landau stepped in with institutional funds to help, departmental funds to help the project keep going, and Emily Labarge did a lot of work in the community to raise foundation and donor support to allow things to go. So they really stepped into the breach and allowed the project to continue unabated until a reapplication came in. And now this application, notice, was funded not by the NIMH, but NIA. Leonard had begun to have discussions with Zovin Kachaturian, who was the head of the program at NIA that funded Alzheimer's research. And Leonard was recounting his difficulty getting NIMH to fund it. And Zovin said, send it to me. And he did. Got a great score, 143. Huge site visit team. Look at that, 23 people. And they noticed and they came here, all 23 came here. And they noticed the major strength was the clinical core. Again, our emphasis, very mild Alzheimer's disease. And it began its funding January 2004. So that's the start of the Healthy Aging Senile Dementia Program project, been continuously funded ever since. Now, there was one critique of that grant, and they found that Leonard actually padded the budget. So here was the critique. So no typewriter. The year after the program project was going and really stabilized the dementia work here, then we put in for our round of an Alzheimer's Disease Research Center grant, a complementary grant to the program project. This was a huge grant, many cores. There was a research component with its own cores, a training component, an administrative component. We would call those cores today. 7 research projects. 5 pilot projects, I mean, an immense grant. And we had another giant review panel, and a summary statement got funded. I note some of the individuals here. You see Gene Rubin, who was the co-leader of the clinical core, and he impressed the site visit team in the summary statement. You can see that they thought he was a productive researcher, very qualified for clinical research. That certainly has been borne out over the past 2 decades. Here's Gene Johnson, who had a project. They were very excited about it, imaginative, extremely important, and interesting experiments. I was pretty young then, and I had a pilot project. You see what they wrote about me. Superb proposal. Junior investigator destined for greatness, not only because he is... I was embarrassed, but you know what. You also may note at that time my hair wasn't entirely gray. It actually was somewhat auburn at that time, but Lucy and I developed a family and became gray pretty quick. Throughout the course, and the ADRC has been continuously funded ever since 1985. So past 2 decades, one of the really terrific hallmarks of this group has been its stability of key individuals. This is an unprecedented time, 2005 to 2007, because we are turning over some of the individuals who have been with us from the inception of this dementia program. So I'll just note here some of the people who are no longer playing an active role, and unfortunately in the case of Leonard, who passed away January of last year, he is no longer with us. But here are some of the key folks who are changing their roles. So Phil Miller has always been involved in the biostatistics core in a major way. He is not leaving the institution, he's not retiring, but he's taking on more and more responsibility for informatics throughout the medical school. So as of this next funding period, Kenji Zhang is going to be taking over as leader of the data management and biostatistics core. Dorothy Edwards began our African American as Satellite in the early 1990s. She has moved to a faculty position at the University of Wisconsin. Monique Williams is taking over. Martha Starant is still with us and is still very active. We're very fortunate, but she has announced that over the next several years she is going to retire, and so she and Denise Head are working together to transition that. Gene Johnson also is still with us, but he's taken on less of a role, no longer has his laboratory, and is primarily in a more administrative capacity. He has always been a key member of our group and been an associate director along with David Holtzman, and we've brought Allison Goat in now, so eventually Allison and David will be the associate directors as well. We've had other leadership changes. So Dan McKeel, long-standing neuropathology core director, has been retired now, and Nigel Cairns has taken over. Randy Buckner left for Harvard. Mark Minton and Denise Head are now leading that core. Tom User left last August, and Jim Galvin is now the Ed Core leader. John Chernansky has been a project leader in both the program project, Healthy Aging and Senile Dementia, and a new program project, the Adult Children's Study. And he is leaving, and he unfortunately is taking his wife with him. I don't know why Cynthia decided to go along, but she is. Cynthia and Dave Sermon have been developing a very elegant website to support the biomarker studies produced by the Adult Children's Study. The reason John and Cynthia are leaving, and I think he told me he's going to be leaving tomorrow, he is taking over on Monday as the department chair of psychiatry at Northwestern School of Medicine, and John and Cynthia are in the back, so let's give them well wishes for their new. Fortunately, they're going to continue to collaborate, so they're not going away forever, but we appreciate all that they've done for us. Now, we do have some stability. There still remain some of us who have been around for a long time. So myself, Gene Rubin, Mary Coates in the clinical core, Betsy has been here from the onset, Dave Belota and Jan Duchek have always had projects in these different grants. So we still have a lot of institutional memory. Now, earlier this month, I had my 60th birthday, and so it came up among a number of people of whether what my plans are for retirement. I announced at the birthday celebration that I don't plan to have any immediate, I don't have any immediate retirement plans. I have much yet that I would like to do, and so I plan to stay on for a while. And I would say for many years at least. Now this is all with the caveat with what my department chair wants me to do, but I would like to stay on for several years more. I thought that this would be greeted when I told people with a lot of relief and elation, but people were kind of glum, and And it turns out that one reason is that I've also said that if I'm staying on, so does everyone else have to stay on, so no one is going to be retiring, so we're all going to stay together. More transitions, just to talk about this. So Dr. Consuelo Wilkins, who's been a clinical core investigator, has just received a grant from the Barnes Jewish Hospital Foundation that will require her to leave her clinical core duties, and she's going to be looking at revitalizing the elderly in the community. We've added 3 clinical nurse specialists to the clinical core, as you see, Sue and Vicki and Angie. Kathy Rowe, who was recruited to the Biostatistics Corps just this past year, came over as an investigator in the clinical core. We've added some help, finally, for Betsy. Gina D'Angelo and Scott Faig are now in the Biostatistics Corps. We've beefed up the Education Corps with Barbie and Murtis. Mary Weiss is just within the past 2 months is now taking over for Jan Palmer as the administrator for the Friedman Center for Aging. Stacy Schneider, who was in the clinical core, has moved to the Memory Diagnostic Center. And Jim Galvin, who is directing the Memory Diagnostic Center now, is building up a complementary Alzheimer treatment unit there, and he's hired Vivian and Patrick to join him. And then I think it's within the past year we've had both Deborah and Karthik join Denise Maui-Dreyfus in the psychometric core. So these are names that you may not know unless you've been engaged with us in the past year or so. So let's talk about the current state of the ADRC, and let's talk about our mission. I think it's a 3-word mission. The ADRC's mission is to prevent Alzheimer's disease. To do that, we have the following aims. The first is really an extension of what began in 1979 with the first really funded study to characterize the clinical, cognitive, behavioral, and biomedical correlates of Alzheimer's disease in comparison with non-demented aging. More recently, we have added to this characterization biomarkers, imaging, biological fluids, genetics, and other biomarkers to try to understand when Alzheimer's disease begins, even prior to the appearance of any dementia symptoms at all. We want to understand the order in which these biomarker changes, which we think reflect the underlying mechanisms of disease. We understand the time sequence and the order in which they occur, so we know how Alzheimer's disease begins in the brain. And of course, ultimately, all these discoveries we want to translate into truly effective therapies. So these are our aims, and ultimately, we want to prevent Alzheimer's disease is our main mission. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on the grant status, and you may want to go to that figure 1 as I talk about this. First grant is really our major continuing grant, Healthy Aging and Senile Dementia, the first program project funded in 1984. You notice that we just submitted our competing renewal for years, 26 through 30? 26 through 30. And the requested amount of direct cost in that 5-year competing renewal application is about $8 million. Direct cost. The Alzheimer's Disease Research Center grant is currently funded. It comes up for renewal next year. It also has about $8 million direct cost. The Antecedent Biomarkers Program Project Grant, which is a derivation of the HASD grant, but at a special group of individuals, the adult children, has about $4 million direct cost. And we think we're going to be awarded a major contract, a UO1 contract for dominantly inherited Alzheimer's network that will start sometime this summer or fall, and that's $16 million over 6 years. So if all of these grants were to be funded, just the direct cost alone, about $37 million. When you add in the indirect cost, of course, it's over $50 million. So that's a tremendous tribute to what we do. I mean, that's a huge sum of money to be applied to one program to do Alzheimer research. It doesn't add into the equation affiliated R01s that we have. It doesn't add in all the multi-center activities in which we are part of, including the Alzheimer's Disease Genetic Consortium, the Late Onset Alzheimer's Disease Initiative, the National Consortium to establish a registry for Alzheimer's disease, the Adult Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study, Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, and the National Alzheimer Coordinating Center, all of which give us funds as well. So it's a huge enterprise. It's really quite remarkable. You can look at Figure 1 and see what the research projects are. Most of them are aimed at identifying biomarkers of individuals who are cognitively normal. Either older normal people in HASD, younger middle-aged people in the adult children's study, and if funded, the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's network would be in people as young as 21. So we're really, in a way, looking at biomarkers across the lifespan if all of these grants are funded. If all of these grants are funded. Now, in real terms, of course, we don't get to keep $37 million. You see a big chunk of that is in this Diane project, and we have 6 other performance sites that will receive a large amount of it, and this is the total amount over 6 years. So if you look at any one year, how much grant support we have to do what we do is about $4 million. So that's what our annual grant budget is. We've been very fortunate to have very generous donors, and they, in recent years, have been providing something a little more than $1 million to our budget, so we're able to do about $5 million worth of research per annum with all of this. I just want to mention, so again, I'm very impressed with everything that this group has done and able to be so successful. If you look at the Diane project, that was submitted in October. Then you look up top at the Healthy Aging, that was submitted in January. That's a heck of a lot of work that was done for major grants. I mean, these are each 500-page grant applications, multiple projects, very difficult. We are very fortunate to have a terrific grants management team. All of you produce the work that goes into the grants. The project leaders and core leaders write the components, but it all has to be brought together. So the last weekend before the grant is done, it usually comes down to people like Linda Amos and Linda Kruger, because I still am not, I don't know if any, probably the young people will be astounded, I still write things out longhand, and Linda has to transcribe. I don't know about Word. Apparently you can do a Word document. I'll do one day, I'm sure. Linda Kruger, Linda Amos, Mary Coates, Betsy Grant. This January, we actually pestered Betsy at home where she was recovering from a near lethal illness, but didn't bother us because it was grant time. And Virginia Buckles. I can't emphasize enough how fortunate we are to have the team led by Virginia that does this. I think Virginia could actually write many of these grants on her own. So let's give her a round of applause. Of course, we're not alone in doing this. We have a lot of help from a lot of people, and some of them are listed here. We're very pleased, as always, to partner with the St. Louis chapter of the Alzheimer Association. Matter of fact, we're going to be meeting with them this afternoon. We're very fortunate to have a very active and very helpful African American advisory board. We have an internal ethics committee that's very helpful for us. We increasingly find, as we proceed into the directions that we're going, that there are issues we haven't fully addressed that we need to understand. Our complementary centers, the Harvey A. Friedman Center for Aging, And we're very pleased, as I mentioned, we rely increasingly on donors and friends to have the support of the Washington University Alumni and Development Office with David Blasingame and David Shear. So these are some of our partners that help us be successful. Now I mentioned that next year we have to write we actually have to write 2 more grants next year. One would be the ADRC in the spring, and then in the fall will be a renewal of the adult children study. Any adult children study project or core leaders out there? You didn't think it was coming up so soon, did you? It's coming up next fall. Here's the RFA for this year's round of ADRCs. So, and this will probably be very similar to what we will have to do next year. So the grant will be due in May. There are 29 Alzheimer's disease centers, federally funded Alzheimer's disease centers throughout the country. 7 of them are up for renewal this year. So they wrote the budget to fund about 7. But it doesn't mean the current ones necessarily will be refunded. New ones are coming in, and they may be chosen over current existing ones. If you do the math, that means 10 ADRCs are coming up next year when we're up. Okay? We assume the budget next year will support 10. We don't know that. One thing we do know is that applicants this year who are not funded will be eligible to come back next year and compete against us. They, of course, will have the benefit of a summary statement to which they can respond to make their application stronger. So next year is going to be a critical year for us. The RFA, I think, is about the same as what we're currently operating, except that they're only allowed 3 projects. That's the way it is now. But one of the projects must be led by a junior investigator, including postdoc fellows or faculty who have yet to receive R01 support. Or it must be someone entirely new to the field. We're only going to be able to increase the budget by 3% over our the last year of our current funding period. So I think that's what we'll be faced with this time next year. And I think we're going to have problems. I want to go over the clinical core. You notice I call it the bread and butter, and I think it always is the most important core because this is where we collect the longitudinal clinical and cognitive data, develop the scans, obtain the genetic material, the biospecimens, the autopsy material. So the clinical core is extremely important. Now here I've listed a snapshot not of the younger people, not the ACS, just our ADRC and HASD individuals. You see, we see about 440 annually. We no longer look at people who have advanced Alzheimer's disease, so we concentrate on CDR0, non-demented, CDR 0.5, very mild, and CDR1 mild, and you can tell by the numbers we're increasingly looking at healthy people. That's where our research is going. You see the group there, the demographics. Note the percent African American, and I mentioned earlier our African American Advisory Board. Just 5 years ago when we went in, the percent African American in our entire sample was about 7%. So we've made important gains in the greater St. Louis metropolitan area. The percent African American is 18%, so we have a ways to go. The reason we emphasize inclusion of African Americans is because our goal to prevent Alzheimer's is to prevent it in all groups in St. Louis. We don't want to learn about the disease just in upper middle class white people. We want to learn about it across the population of the St. Louis area so that it's applicable to everybody. All right, now, I said the clinical core is in trouble. For years, we follow people on an annual basis. We're based upon longitudinal data collection. So everyone comes back on an annual basis. We think we should be getting about 80% or better every year. Some people die, some people relocate, some people are ill, can't come in certain years. So there's some attrition, but 80% is our minimum return rate. Well, here's what we did this year, 68%. Now, we almost get about 80% if we count people who come back for a second or third assessment. They may not come back on their annual anniversary. They may be in the hospital or something of that sort, but they'll come back ultimately. But even that is below the minimum of 80%. That's not good. Autopsy rate. I've always reported our autopsy rate at 60 to 70%. Reported it at that in our application last month. Betsy now tells me that's not true. This is our autopsy rate, 50%. These are people who die, who we've seen. They die, we get the brain. That's very poor. It was 56% last year. The year before it was 43%. Now the reason it's poor, Betsy tells me, I think this is right, is now she has a better way to assess who dies. In the past, we reported the autopsy rate of people who we knew died. Well, now she's gone out, she's gummed up the works because she's added people that we didn't know have died. So our autopsy rate is lower. Another reason it's lower is we don't follow people past CDR1. We don't stay in contact with them as they go to CDR2 and CDR3. So we lose autopsies in that group. But then look at what our autopsy rate is in the people we do follow. It's even worse. It's 36%. CDR0, 0.5, CDR1. This is going to be a major problem for us in our application next year, an autopsy rate this low. We're built upon integrating data across all modalities. I mentioned all of the things that we do, the biomarker studies, imaging studies, personality studies. So you think that a program built upon this would have a high rate of completion of all of these projects. Matter of fact, we only enroll people now if they agree to do all the projects. They know coming in that they're going to do them all. So again, there might be some attrition, and we think we have about an 80% completion rate of the cognitive testing, the psychometric battery, the blood draw for DNA, and an MRI. Basic things. This doesn't include a Randy Bateman 36-hour lumbar puncture. Doesn't include that. Just the basic things. What is our completion rate? Is it better than 80%? 50%. Then you add LP, less than 40%. We're going to get hit very hard that we're not getting the majority of our people to do the studies that we say that they all agree to do. Now, there are reasons for this, and I'll get to that. It's not that we're slacking off, but these are major problems that must be corrected if we want to be successful in our renewal next year. We do clinical trials. Here are the trials that we're presently doing. For the large part, we only now accept trials that are really disease of what we think are disease-modifying agents. You see, these all address amyloid beta. There's one trial going on in the ETU of a phase 4 study for a patch. But we could do other trials, but we don't have the resources. We don't have the person power in the clinical core, and more importantly, we don't have the participants. Once they go into these trials, they're very demanding. Lots of scans, lots of LPs. The people who are eligible and willing to do them is a very small pool of people. And often, once they complete one of these trials, they're no longer eligible for another one because we may have affected the mechanism of the disease. These are trials we could do, been asked to do, been actually begged to do, but we can't do them because of insufficient resources. So 2 other antibody studies, both of which we have actually done the phase 2 trial. Now they're moving to phase 3 and we can't accept them. Secretase, promoter, and a siloinositol. So these are all disease-modifying therapies that we would intellectually and clinically like to do that we cannot. All right, have we accomplished things after all this dire news? Yes, we have. Maybe I will. So Lizzie Barron, as many of you know, was a visiting scholar with us. She's from Santiago, Chile, a neurologist. The first clinical scientific paper I wrote was published in 1984, talking about something called the PIC Alzheimer's spectrum. It talked about a family that we now call as hereditary dysphasic disinhibition dementia. And it's been a very useful family for us, and it's led to a much larger family with a very similar phenotype, HDDD2. And just recently, Lizzie and Nigel and others and Allison have been able to classify this as a frontotemporal lobar degeneration family with a progranulin mutation. So that's one scientific contribution we made. Nigel has continued his work on the neuropathology and the neuropathologic classification, and has been able to advance the classification using the new protein TDP43. Jim Galvin has continued his work on the clinical core, trying to find a combination of informant-based questions and examination of the patient that will screen for dementia with high accuracy. Jan Ducek and Dave Belota and others continue to explore personality differences and find that people in the very early stage are distinguished from non-demented aging by neuroticism. Kathy Rowe has been interested in the cognitive reserve hypothesis, published a paper last year, and again just in last month on the role of education. Ann Fagan, Dave Holtzman, and others have been examining the cerebral spinal fluid levels of A beta, 42, tau, other proteins, and correlating them with other modalities, most notably amyloid imaging with PET-PIB with Mark Minton. Randy Bateman has been looking at the diurnal fluctuation of A beta, indicating that it's important to know when the sample is drawn to interpret the level appropriately. Keone Kwai in Allison's lab has been using as an endophenotype A beta levels in the CSF to identify genetic variation, and in doing so found a mutation in a late onset Alzheimer family. Dan Marcus has been very involved in data sets, beginning with the Central Neuroimaging Data Archive that he and Randy Buckner established, but increasingly it will serve as a platform for data integration across a number of projects. And Dan and Randy have made this available publicly in this open access series, and others have used it very productively. Kenji has been studying the statistical analyses of Alzheimer publications. I'm very particularly proud of this last paper because I am the senior author. So it really adds to my statistical credibility quite a bit. I mentioned the full panoply of awards is in your packet. Just notice a few. Gene Johnson is a fellow in the AAAS. By the way, everyone, I think, is aware that this Friday is the Johnson Symposium in Epnic. Dave Holtzman, a year ago this month, was awarded the MetLife Foundation Award for Medical Research. Martha Sturant last summer was given the American Psychological Association Committee on Aging Award for her, and Joel Price just recently was given the School of Medicine's Distinguished Faculty Award for his graduate student teaching, and Consuelo Wilkins for her community service. So let's give them all a round of applause. Other accomplishments, a paper of our biomarker work combined with our PET-PIB work was rated by the editors of Annals of Neurology as the highest impact paper for the past 2 years. Published 3 books. By the way, I have copies outside and we'll be able to sign them for you for a small fee. Randy and Dave have taken their technology to measure A beta production and clearance in vivo in humans, and that's a very potentially powerful tool for drug companies that have A beta modifying compounds to determine efficacy, and they've developed a company, C2N Diagnostics. This all began with an ADRC pilot grant. Mentioned earlier that Jim Galvin has been looking at dementia screeners and has developed an informant-based screening tool that is now being used by pharma. You can't see it, but down at the bottom here is Pfizer and Eisai. They go around and handle this AD8 to practicing physicians. The impact of the Alzheimer's Center. We do have, I think, maybe not as much influence as we would like, but I think we have a great deal of influence. It may not rise to the top all the time, but I think we're very influential. The clinical task force of the Alzheimer's disease centers. So the 30 or so Alzheimer's disease centers grew up, each with their own way of evaluating, diagnosing patients. And eventually we decided, or we were mandated really by the NIA, to do it in a standard and uniform manner. So there was a clinical task force convened by the centers and the National Institute on Aging, and I was named chair. And out of that came the uniform data set by which now all centers must agree. It's part of the RFA. They must agree to assess their patients in this way with this clinical and cognitive battery. Now, there's a lot of grumbling about the UDS because it means that every center that adopted it, and they must adopt it, would have to do it on top of what they have already been doing for many years, and in some cases have to change the way they're doing it. There was even, this is hard to believe, even some grumbling from this center. Hard to believe that. Because if I hadn't have been chair, I will tell you it would have been terrible. Because most centers do not use informants, do not require them. Now, the UDS, every center has to have an informant, including the non-demented controls. Most centers don't have the physician or the nurse clinician provide a diagnosis. They make a diagnosis based upon psychometric performance, cut scores, then they bring it to a consensus conference, and they do it. So if we had not been involved in this, we would have had to change drastically the way we diagnose and follow dementia. So we're lucky. More centers are doing it more of our way than we would have had to follow them. I chair 9 external advisory committees of other ADCs, and I'm on one other one, so I influence 10 other ADCs. Allison is on 2 external advisory committees. I'm on the council now for the National Institute of Aging. I chair the working group on program. It's not a major influence, but I've been asked to chair, I think, 2 important things. One is the intramural work done by the NIA. So I'm head of a review committee that's evaluating that. And importantly, the branch of the NIA that funds the Alzheimer's centers and funds our programs, the neuroscience and neuropsychology of aging. I chair that also. We're going to review their portfolio and be able to point them to areas in which we think they may want to invest more resources. I can already tell you that one recommendation from this review committee is to fund more research at Washington University. Allison and I serve on the Alzheimer's Association Medical and Scientific Advisory Council, which helps set scientific policy and helps determine funding for applicants. The American Academy of Neurology, neurologists form sections, epilepsy section, stroke section, sleep medicine section, and dementia section, called geriatric neurology. And the section heads get together twice a year to discuss policy and problems involved with all of them. And I chair the executive committee for that committee on sections, so I learn about academy policy because the president-elect is on this executive committee, president-elect of the American Academy. We still remain very dedicated to our training mission, and we're very pleased that Nupur Ghoshal, who is a graduate of our neurology residency program, is our ADRC fellow. She's in her first year, and we're pleased also to welcome 3 very delightful and very productive visiting scholars, Dr. Sakata, Dr. Corrales, and Dr. Parimi. If they're here, can I have all 4 of you stand, please? All right, yeah, there's the... We also have accomplishments through our outreach. The Berg Symposium, I think, is now very well established. It attracts an international audience. We had over 170 people last September, for a very interesting program. The Norman Say Lecture is in honor of the first chair of our African American Advisory Board. Our first lecturer was Jennifer Manley in 2006, and last fall, Peggy Dilworth Anderson. The importance of this, I don't want to understate this. The Say Lecture attracts a large audience, 115 individuals. We held it in this auditorium. But it turns out it's the first named lecture at Washington University for an African American. So I think that's an important precedent. We've completed a MetLife video that apparently is going to play on PBS. And this weekend, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, HBO is coming to film us do all kinds of things. And this is for a program they're going to put on next year. So we have a lot of work coming up this weekend. I mentioned the American Academy of Neurology. It holds an annual meeting each spring, this year in April. They want to become, I don't know if it will happen, they want to become the spring neuroscience meeting. To that end, they used to accept about 50% of the scientific abstracts submitted to them. Now they're accepting 85%. They really want to accept 100%, just like the Society for Neuroscience. Their space won't be as big as the Society for Neuroscience meeting, so some of these abstracts may have to be online. But the point is, for you who go to meetings, this is going, I think, if things turn out, to be an important venue for presenting scientific work. Threats. Internally, we're overgrown at the Memory and Aging Project, where we house our clinical and psychometric cores and our administrative core. We've already had to move the psychometricians from the, what do we call it now, the ground floor? We don't call it the basement, right? The ground floor, where we're all centered. They are now a floor or two above us, so they're off-site. The education core is out of the building. They're in our building next door. So we're already fragmented physically. We're starting a satellite at Barnes-Jewish West County Hospital next month. This primarily is enforced by the closing of Highway 40. We think that it will allow us to capture more of our West County volunteers out there, but that's going to bring some problems with it. Because we're so big, we have lots of internal fragmentation forces, including the idea each core wants to handle its own data, understandable, but it's hard to integrate when we're not all contributing to our central data repository. And it's easy to have someone approach a core leader and say, whether internal to Washington University or external, and can I have some of your tissue? Can I have some of your DNA, some of your brain tissue, some of your CSF, some of your clinical data? And sure, but then that doesn't keep the ADRC in the loop. So integration efforts. Keep Betsy in the loop. Okay? All data, whether it's processed or otherwise, ultimately must reside in the data management and statistics core. Dan Marcus and others are leading, Phil Miller leading this informatics core that help us accomplish this data integration process. We need to get credit. The grants that support the work need to be credited. When we apply for these competing renewals, these are evaluated very carefully. Have we been productive? So one, cite the grants from which the data ultimately accrue in the publications, and submit the papers to Virginia so we know what's out there. Another integration force is our Tuesday noon seminar, the derivation of the original brown bag lunch. All ADRC components, projects, cores, pilots are going to be presenting, and the major ones presenting twice a year. So we all keep in touch with what everyone else is doing. Every 2 years, including this summer, is the International Conference on Alzheimer's Disease, this year in Chicago in July. And many of us are going. the presentations that we are producing will all be done here for our use just before we go to Chicago in July 22nd. So I want everyone to be there so we see all the work that is going on. All right, so we all know this, that there are lots and lots of older people and the population is aging. Alzheimer's as a chronic disease is very costly. The increase to Medicare are going to double really by 2020, not even 15 years. Medicare costs have, because of this, have expanded. The country is not prepared, cannot fund that now. Certainly won't be able to fund it in 12 years. Can't fund it now. So the president has three choices to fund Medicare with the driven forces increase in health care costs for a rapidly aging population. One, can make the patients pay more of those Medicare costs. That's one thing you can do. Two, you can give less benefit to the patient. Three, you can reduce reimbursement to physicians and hospitals. Now, do you think there are more people, voters, over the age of 65 than there are physicians? Yes. So his choice this year is not to reduce benefits to patients or shift costs to patients, but to reduce payments to physicians and hospitals. You see the proposal, reduce it by 10.6% this July and by an additional 5% next January. Now my concern, all of our concern, of course, is physicians are going to say, I can't see older people for this. So older people are not going to get medical care that they should get. Of course, Medicare physician payment haven't been the drivers of this increased cost. Medicare physician payment rates have been essentially the same for the past 6 years. What about research? Well, the budget for the NIA is flat. It's up about $2 million from what it was last year. You see the NIH budget as a whole, $29.3 billion, was 1.1% above last year. The budget for NIH as a whole, for NIA in particular, NIA funds us, doubled in 1994 to 2003. That was a terrific thing. Really increased our research, also increased our research infrastructure, and the number of investigators that are doing research. Guess what? All those investigators now are putting in applications. So the number of applications has increased dramatically. But the NIA budget since 2003 is flat, and if you account for inflation, it actually has gone down. So the grant success rate has gone down quite dramatically as well. The NIA says they need about 25% success rate for grants to just keep research going at a steady state. To pursue new lines of research, it needs to be higher than 25%, but this is what 25% is the minimum. Here are the NIA budgets. The light gray is the actual budget, and you see it increased during this period up to 2003, and then essentially it's been flat ever since. The dark gray are the real dollars, once you adjust for inflation, and there's been a 13% decrease over that period of time. Decrease. Constant dollars is what it's called. They're going down. Here's the grant success rate at NIA. Again, up to 2003, pretty good, around 30%, more or less. Sharp drop. Last year it went up a little bit. Do you know why? Fewer applications. People are now discouraged because of this miserable success rate. So there are just fewer grants being submitted. Most importantly, fewer first-time grants, junior investigators. Success rate for an initial application, less than 10%. There's something called a merit award, which gives an investigator long-term support. No merit awards are being recommended. You can't invest in that. Successful grants have decreased buying power. If this, as an example, were a recommended award by the study section, the NIA makes an administrative cut to fund other grants, so you actually have budgeted your work, your time and effort for this amount, and you're going to have to do it for that amount. The budget cut was 18%. It's gone up. You notice 20% in reduced budget. You remember what we said about our longitudinal follow-up rate? We wanted 80% or above. We're about 66%. We have less resources, less clinical slots to see our patients. This is affecting us. This is particularly important. R01s are usually for 4 or 5 years at about an average of $300,000 a year. Now, for the first time, the R21s, which is a much shorter and much less amount, equal the number of R01s. People are trying to get any grant they can so that there's a loss of continuity in personnel. Fewer people being funded for long-term, high investment research, much more short-term, temporary research. So challenges. Well, the first three I think everyone knows, mentioned them. We're going to be faced with the challenge of this aging population and chronic illnesses such as Alzheimer's. We are committed in the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center to investigating the health disparities in Alzheimer's disease awareness, treatment, and research among different communities. And I've just mentioned the downtrend in U.S. funding for biomedical research, which I think is a serious problem. But we have an opportunity in this Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So I want to leave on this note because I really think that we are leading the charge in what is a critically important goal. And that is, we always are going to be caring for people who have symptomatic Alzheimer's disease. We always are. We need to do that. But it's going to be much harder to get truly effective therapies once the person is demented to try to cure them. Matter of fact, we know what it's like now. It's not successful. So what we are trying to do, and we're at the forefront, is this paradigm shift, and that is we want to detect the beginnings of the disease before the symptoms and transform our therapeutic approach from trying to cure symptomatic people to trying to prevent the disease. Thanks very much.